let's move on to the next interview.
Cancer fundamentally involves an electrical dysregulation among cells. It's basically a dissociative identity disorder on the part of the cells. It's literally a disorder of the cognitive glue that binds individual cells towards large-scale purpose, where large-scale purpose, I mean building organs and tissues and things like that, as opposed to being amoebas and doing amoeba-level things.
I don't know if I'll get to this part in the interview. This is sort of a preview, but he says there that cancer is basically a dissociative identity disorder. Imagine that you have a critique of psychology such that you even reject the notion that there's such a thing as a dissociative identity disorder, that these kind of supposed mental illnesses aren't real. And yet again, what he's invoked there is this idea of cognition. So the cells have some kind of cognition. So again, it's a continuum, the continuum of cognition as well. So it's fine. I don't have a problem if people want to use this kind of language. It makes, well, I kind of do, because it just makes things that much more difficult when you want to talk about what kind of thinking or cognition is going on that is special with human beings, that allows for civilization, for physics, for space travel, for understanding physical reality. And if we're just going to say everything has cognition, everything has a personality of some kind, including cancer cells, then it just means that we have to spend so much longer trying to explain what it is we're talking about without using what we hitherto these useful shorthands, like cognition. What a person does when they're engaged in thinking, cognition being very similar things.
And we've shown in these animal models both that we can detect incipient tumor formation and we can prevent and normalize tumors after they form by restoring, not by fixing the DNA if there is any DNA issue, not by killing the cells with chemotherapy, but by electrically reconnecting them to the group such that they can form, again, a memory of what they're supposed to be doing.
Mike, very nice to finally connect.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thanks for making the time.
Of course. Yeah, thanks for having me.
We have lots of ground to explore, and I thought we would begin with a book that had a spot on my bookshelf when I was a kid. It seems like you and I may have found it at the same time, but you did a lot more with it than I did. The author is Robert O. Becker. Is that enough of a cue to tee it off?
I think it is.
All right. What is the book and why is it relevant?
I'm going to guess it's the Bioelectric.
That's right.
Yeah, it's very relevant. I discovered it in an old bookstore that my dad and I visited when I was in Vancouver, Canada for the World's Fair in '86. And I found this thing, and it's kind of a patchwork of a number of different things, right? Like he was into applied field of dangers and things like that. But I was just stunned with.
So I'm going to skip the introductory remarks and move to the part where I have no quarrel, where he seems to have done some very interesting research, and he explains it here. And I've been to his research papers and had a look at those and the explainer videos, explainer articles that he has, that it all seems robust, for want of another word, and good.
So what happens, just as an example, what happens in these flatworms, these two-headed flatworms that you were referring to, the flatworm has a...
So here he's going to talk about his actual research on these flatworms. So let's go to that.
Programmable. So what happens, just as an example, what happens in these flatworms, these two-headed flatworms that you were referring to, the flatworm has a bioelectric memory in it that says, and we can see it. I'm saying these things because we can now see these memories and we can rewrite them at will. So this is now actionable in the lab. It has a bioelectric memory that says one head. That memory is not genetically encoded. What is genetically encoded is a bunch of hardware that when you first turn on the juice, it basically acquires that memory as a default. It's the way when you buy a calculator from the store and you turn on the power, they all say zero, right? Reliably, 100% of the time, they all say zero. Great. But that zero is not the only thing that circuit can do, right? As you find out very quickly, they can store memory and do all these things. The genetic hardware of the worm is very good at making sure that every worm starts out with a very specific, it's a little bit, I think, related to instinct and how, certain birds are born knowing how to make nests and things like that. Mm-hmm. The hardware has defaults.
Birds are born knowing how to make nests. This is a crucial part of, the Dawkins-Darwin worldview on evolution by natural selection. There you have something known as the extended phenotype, and Richard Dawkins wrote an excellent book on this in order to explain how it is that, well, birds make nests, among other things. It's because the genome encodes the recipe for building nests, and a phenotype is how genes are expressed in an environment. And sometimes those genes can be expressed not merely in the living part of the bird's body or the organism's body, but also out there in the environment itself. So the nest of a bird is part of its phenotype, part of the way in which the genes express themselves. It's just outside of the body. So too with a spider's web, and I'll come back to the spider's web in just a second.
And by default, one head. But the hardware is reprogrammable. So what we were able to do is go in and identify the memory that actually says how many heads, and we can change it. And when you change it, you don't need to change the hardware. You don't need to change the genetics any more than when we form new memories. You don't need to change the genes in your brain to form new memories. I always say to people, on your laptop, if you want to go from Photoshop to Microsoft Word, you don't get out your soldering iron and start rewiring. It'd be laughable if you had to, but that's how we used to do it. In the 40s and 50s, you program a computer by pulling and plugging wires. Well, you don't do that anymore because it's reprogrammable. And that's what the biology is. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing, just very quickly, and we can get into it if you want, is that the cellular intelligence that exists not only is reprogrammable, but it is actually creative in the sense that it interprets the DNA. And we can talk about this. It doesn't blindly do what the DNA says. And this is kind of a deep thing because it's the way our cognition works too. It interprets memories in a way that is improvisational. It does not simply follow what they say, counter to what we all learn.
So I think that's great. That's all to the good. That's fine. Again, to say that, well, the flatworm has intelligence because it has memory, and that memory can be perturbed in some way by doing experiments. And so you can have a worm that its default is to have one head, but without changing the genetics. Without changing the genetics is the key point that Michael Levin is saying here. But by changing the electrical signaling, which is the experiment that he does, then it will grow two heads instead. And if you chop off one of the heads, it will regrow the second head. So not everything is in the genome. And that's great, okay? More power to him in doing these experiments. To say that it's kind of intelligence, though, okay, well, again, I'm just repeating myself. We're left with the problem of how to distinguish between the capacities of human beings, which at the moment appear to be unique on planet Earth, the capacity to explain the world and control the world, and eventually come to understand at ever higher fidelity all of physical reality without limit. How to describe that without referring to intelligence and creativity, or I suppose we can say explanatory creativity, it just becomes all that more difficult if we attribute these qualities to, well, almost absolutely everything. So I'll just give him a few minutes more on this part before getting to the controversial part, because this is all excellent stuff, and I couldn't support him more in continuing to do this work. No criticisms.
All right. So I'm going to come back to this sort of how the textbooks might be revised question in a minute. But before we get there, you said we can see memories, right? So this is empirically demonstrable in the lab. What does it mean to see those memories? What does that actually mean and look like? And then secondly, with the flatworms with the two heads, why does that persist, if it does, into future generations?
So what we can see directly are the bioelectrical properties of tissues. And we've developed tools using voltage-sensitive fluorescent dyes. And so that means you take your embryo or your tissues or whatever you've got, and you soak it in this special chemical that glows different degrees or different wavelengths depending on what the local voltage is. And so back in the olden days in electrophysiology, you had an electrode and you would have to poke like a little needle and you would poke every cell and you would get the voltage reading. We don't need to, of course, we still do that for certain purposes, but what you can now do is get a full map of the whole tissue all at once. And in fact, you can make movies of it and watch it change over time. And we have these amazing videos of embryos changing their electrical activities over time. It's basically like what neuroscientists do when they do imaging in brains, but we can do it in the rest of the body. So there, what you see are the electrical patterns. Now, from there, you have to do a lot of experiments to prove that what you're looking at are, in fact, memories. And there are many different kinds of things we do, but functionally, what you have to show is that you can decode the electrical pattern that you're seeing and show that what it encodes is the future set points towards which the cells will work. In other words, I can take a one-headed worm, I can change the voltage pattern. It's still a one-headed worm, but its internal representation of what a correct worm should look like now says 2 heads. You don't see it because it's a latent memory, but when you cut the thing into pieces, now what the cells do is consult the memory and they say, oh, 2 heads, and then they build 2 heads and you get your 2-headed worm. So you don't know right away when you're first looking at it, you don't know that that's a memory. You have to do experiments to prove that that's what it actually is.
So that's very cool. Okay, that's an insight. That's something new, so far as I'm aware. I don't know. Again, I'm not a biologist, so I don't know the field and whether or not other people have replicated this, whether anyone ever did it before. But it seemed it's a unique idea to me. I haven't heard of this before. The fact that without changing the genetic code, and by changing, applying a potential difference or an electric field to these worms, once they've been cut up, they'll then grow another head. But it seems totally plausible to me and potentially useful in some distant future. As I say, atoms can be turned into ions by removing electrons, so they've got a charge. Molecules have polarities, as famously water molecules do, because water is H2O. The O contains 8 protons and the hydrogen only has 1 proton, so therefore the oxygen atom in the water molecule draws towards it far more electrons, and so it tends to be negatively charged compared to the hydrogen, which is left to be a slightly positive end, and so therefore water has this capacity to stick to itself and form surface tension and has a high melting and boiling point. All that sort of stuff comes out of this fact that water is a polar molecule. And so it's unsurprising, lipids are complicated molecules that have polarity associated with them as well, and they're important parts of cells. So the cells could have polarity and have associated electric fields with them, and you have multicellular things. You put lots of cells together, you put cells together into tissues, and they can become electrical. So I am unsurprised at any of this kind of research, and I imagine that it would be very useful to perturb the electric field in some distant future, which might help to treat diseases. It seems, I don't hear doctors talking about this kind of thing, but that's what happens. The scientists first have to do some of this work, like Michael Levin's doing on worms, and then maybe one day in the distant future, we just apply an electric field to you and it repairs your brain or your arm that you've lost or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, more power to him on that. So all of his research stuff, of course, more power to him, as I keep on saying. But let's go to the part where I may well disagree. So this is an hour 37, no, more than that. It's over an hour and a half's worth of interview here. So I'm just going to go to a part all about the frame problem.
Should actually be this is how we got here, is talking about animal placebo, because there are studies in experimenter effects in animals. There are whole books on this where in behavioral science, they do these experiments on rats, and whatever the experimenter believes is what the rats end up doing. They don't need to understand the placebo. They're gonna do it anyway if the experimenter believes, right? So trying to understand some of these subtle cues and influences and how does your body know things, I think is like super, super interesting.
Okay. I can't let that one go. So what do you think is actually happening there between the experimenter and the rats? I mean, is it just the subtle body language, et cetera, that's being transmitted to an animal who's perceiving that? That seems like a stretch, even as I say it, but I don't know what the alternative explanation would be.
Yeah.
What might be a theory or two for what is actually happening?
Yeah, good question. I don't have a theory, but I will mention some things to think about.
This concerns me. As far as I know, what he's referring to here is the Rosenthal-Fode experiments. They were done in 1963. As I understand it, what's going on here is you give research students rats and a maze, and you want to see which rats get through the maze faster. Here's the key. You tell one group of research students that your rats are the smart rats, and you tell the other research students your rats are the stupid rats. And then you time, even though there's no difference between the rats, right? There's no difference between the rats. You're just telling the research students this. And then you time how long it takes for the rats to get through the maze. And reliably, the students that you've told their rats are smart, their rats actually win. Now, Tim Ferriss is impressed by this. Michael doesn't have an alternative explanation for this. That worries me. And it worries me because he should know what an explanation would be, rather than couching it in terms of there's some weird conscious force that is going from the researcher to the research students to the rats. One possibility, quite simply, okay, if you want to explain why would it be that these otherwise identical rats, when the researcher is told that you've got the smart rats and the smart rats make it through the maze faster, why should that be the case? How is this information being transmitted from the original research scientists to the rats? How do the rats know that anyone's ever suggested that they're the smart rats? Because of the way in which the researcher interacts with the rats. This is not a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. This is not a double-blind test. Double-blind means you don't tell researchers that you've got smart rats and dumb rats, because there's no such thing. What is done by telling this research student that you've got a smart rat is he is very careful with handling the rat. He handles the rat in a different way. He rewards the rat in a different way. The students who are told you've got the dumb rats, the worthless rats, the hopeless rats, the rats that are likely to lose in this competition, they might be a little bit more cruel, careless, mean to the rats and not expect them to win. There's all sorts of non-verbal things that can go on in the treatment of rats by these research students. So the fact that Michael wouldn't even mention this, it worries me, because it seems as if he wants to shoehorn in consciousness as the explanation when there are possibly many other competing theories. I've just thought of one. The way in which the research students treat the rats once they've been told that they've got a certain kind of rat.
They can show that a rat can generate a temperature difference of a few degrees Celsius between its ears if you reward for that, right? And so now just think, and it doesn't take years of practice. It's pretty quick. And just think, you're a rat. You just got some reward. So let me see. Well, my tail was pointing north and my whiskers were kind of vibrating and my gut was doing this and my toes were like, what the hell did I just get rewarded for, right? You would think, and this in computer science, this is called the frame problem, because
the rat is definitely not thinking any of that. Okay, that is conflating what an organism does instinctually with what a person thinks explicitly. In other words, a person will literally have those thoughts in their head as language. Which way was I facing? Was it that way or that way? A rat would not think that. A rat instinctually will do a particular thing or not, given a reward. But it's not But the way that Michael is talking about the rats is as if they have cognition that resembles what goes on with a human being, even though they don't have language of the sort that a human being does. But this is whole thing about the continuum that he believes in. The continuum's everywhere with everything, it seems.
says, oh, there's a bomb, I got to get out of here, and it leaves, except the bomb was on a cart that was connected to the robot, right? So it goes with him, and of course he blows up. So what does the next robot do? This may be Dan, I don't remember. So the next robot is like, okay, we have to have them consider all the options, right?
Okay, I'll skip past this. Yeah, the frame problem is this idea in artificial intelligence, among other things, of it's a misconception that's popular now. People say things like, and I was talking about it only recently, why not just give ChatGPT or Claude or Grok, or name your AI, large language model, why not just give it a camera for eyes and microphones for ears and then let it go out into the world and discover the new laws of physics? Well, what does it look for is the whole problem, okay? People have problems, they have interests and are curious about stuff, so we look around our environment and go, haven't seen that before, I wonder what that is, let me try and explain it. But that's because we have these intrinsic motivations, if you like. We have problems. No one has yet figured out how to program having a problem in a large language model. Large language models don't have problems. We prompt them. We ask them for stuff. So if you gave ChatGPT a camera for eyes and a microphone for ears, then you would have to prompt it, because it's not going to prompt itself. And once you've prompted it, or who knows, I don't know, this experiment could be done, presumably. It would be simple to do. The fact that no one's done it, or perhaps they have tried, it's likely failed, because the robot has to know what to look for if it's going to start solving problems. It needs to have a problem before it starts solving problems. Here's the simple thing. Okay, as I say, skipping a bit, and I'm going to a chapter that they've titled Binary Thinking is a Trap. So we've already talked a little bit about this. Let's take a deep dive now.
And this is a term that has very specific meaning for you, so it may not be the right term for me to use, but cognition. Let's talk about human cognition in the way that most people would think about it, right? We have this big ball of fat inside our skulls, bunch of magic seems to happen, and we've got these amazing tools. We've got these MRIs, PET scans, et cetera, that we can, EEGs and so on, that we can use to try to study the brain and what's actually happening. And my question is, and not to belabor this type of question, but it's just a forcing function for conversation, sort of 10 years out, 10 years from now, how the textbooks, and textbooks may or may not even exist at that point, but how the teaching of neuroscience might have fundamentally changed as it relates to cognition. Because I look at, for instance, funding a lot of neuroscience over the last...
So Tim's question here seems to me to be misconceived. Now, we'll see whether or not Michael actually gets into talking about, because Tim began the question with respect to human cognition. He said human cognition.
Cognition. Let's talk about human cognition.
Humans. So the unique thing there is, as I would say, on our worldview, this capacity to possess the universality of explanation. Explanatory universality. That's the key thing. So that will be the interesting thing. But it won't come from neuroscience. Neuroscience seems to be just wide of the mark here. That's not a useful way of trying to come at understanding this. That's the hardware. We're talking about software. The hardware of neuroscience and studying neurons by whatever means, or studying the whole brain using, fMRIs or EEGs or whatever else, that's not going to help. Again, that is like, you've got a problem with your Excel spreadsheet, and then, literally unscrewing the cover on your laptop and fiddling with the processor. Of course, that's the wrong level of analysis. Your problem is with the software, not with the hardware. And looking ever more closely at the hardware is not going to solve your software problem. So trying to understand this problem of what grants a human being explanatory universality, or at the very least, this capacity to have a vastly different repertoire of problems that it can attempt to solve, the human being can attempt to solve, as compared to any other system that we know of in the entire universe. What makes that difference won't be helped by looking ever more closely at neurons or even the brain. We need an explanation of what the heck is going on in terms of the software. What is this algorithm? And if you reject the idea that that's the way the question should be phrased, you're just rejecting the Turing principle, that what's going on here is a computation. Now, you might say, well, I don't like the fact that it's a computation. Well, we just have a disagreement with the laws of physics now, because all physical processes are computations in a sense. Let's keep going, though.
Funding a lot of neuroscience over the last 10 years. It's like, okay, sometimes the scientists are attracted to whatever the fanciest tools might be. There's some prestige in that. They produce a lot of beautiful images. You can slice and dice the data from a single study 15 different ways and get a lot of publications. And this is not something I could kind of technically defend. I'm left feeling, as a lot of people do, that there's something missing. It's not quite capturing the full picture, pun intended, not just with the MRIs, but with a lot of these tools that we're using. And I'm bringing this up because of the comment you made about the gap between the biologics and current engineering. And this certainly relates to AI and so on, but I don't have the technical chops to understand quantum effects. But if I think about some of the cursory reading I've done about sort of quantum effects and olfaction, let's just say, right, smell, I'm just left wondering what we might be missing fundamentally about how cognition works, and also ties into, not to turn this into my own TED Talk, I'll try to wrap this up in a second, but having conversations with my friend Kevin Kelly, who is the founding editor of Wired Magazine, who's an avid beekeeper, and about just the collective memory of hives and properties that you would never be able to predict. And that I'm not entirely sure you can, at least at this point, engineer from the ground up. But how do you think our view of cognition, thinking, mind might change in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, it's the wrong level of analysis to be thinking that understanding cognition or learning or knowledge creation, what it is that people do uniquely, won't come from ever finer high fidelity reproductions of fMRI images of the brain, in the same way that trying to look ever more closely at a processor isn't going to tell you what the processor can do. It's a different question. Or what the processor is running. Okay? Better to look at the screen of the computer to see what it's outputting. But as to what relevance quantum effects have on the questions of cognition, I think that is very wide of the mark indeed. I just can't see the connection between what's going on in the quantum with what's going on with our ability to explain the quantum, for example, or anything else. Let's see what Michael has to say. Remember, it was couched in terms of human cognition.
The one thing that I think for sure is going to change is that there's a thriving emerging field out there now called diverse intelligence. This is the idea that biology, and as I've been pushing it, also non-biology, has been doing intelligence of different kinds long before brains and neurons appeared. It's been solving problems, navigating spaces, having memories, anticipating the future long before neurons appeared. The biggest barriers to this are these ancient categories that we got saddled with from pre-scientific times.
So by intelligence, long before brains and neurons appear, it seems like he's talking about computation. And he makes a big deal about memory. But of course, all computers have memory of a sort. There's memory and there's a processor. And you have inputs and you have outputs through this thing. And of course that, we can consider physical systems that way as well. And again, if we define or explain creativity as just a thing, just a feature of any organism, regardless of its complexity, because it is, for some definition of problem, able to come up with a solution, and you call that intelligence, well, okay, but again, for those of us interested in what it is that makes people unique, this doesn't help. And we were asked about human cognition. Anyway.
Long before brains and neurons appeared. It's been solving problems, navigating spaces, having memories, anticipating the future long before neurons appeared. The biggest barriers to this are these ancient categories that we got saddled with from pre-scientific times. This idea that everything is binary. People ask, is it intelligent? Is it conscious? Is it this or that? Like, that binary framing has been holding everything back for a really long time.
Is it holding it back because it's bifurcated between inanimate and animate, or is it something else?
I don't think it's been holding anyone back. No one, I don't think it's held people back. It may be binary or it may not be. I think all approaches would help at this point because no one knows what makes a thing conscious or not, what makes a thing intelligent or not, what makes a thing creative or not. But again, if you're saying that everything's creative because maybe everything has a memory to some extent, memory is a very easy, like, you just need a capacitor and then you've got memory. If the capacitor is full, that's a 1. If the capacitor is empty, that's a 0. There you've got memory. You can store memory. And you've got lots of capacitors, you can store lots of zeros and ones. That sort of thing is straightforward. And you can have the biological analogues of capacitors. They're either storing the thing or they're not storing the thing, and you can call that memory. And you can call what it's doing a computation. If you want to call that kind of computation intelligence, okay.
It's the idea that it obscures the fact that we don't have a good story of scaling. Just 2 quick examples. When you go to court, there's this notion of an adult, okay? We all know, if you really think about it, nothing happens on the night of your 18th birthday, like literally nothing. And that's A. And B, we don't actually have a good story of a scientifically grounded story of what does it mean to have personal responsibility? How does that change over time? How is it impacted by neurotransmitters, brain tumors, Twinkies, society, like whatever? We don't actually have those questions answered, but you've got to get traffic court done or whatever. And so we've just decided we're going to have this thing called adult. We're going to clock it on the 18. The car rental industry actually does better because they look at statistics and they'll say, no, actually it's 25 is when you're like more fully cooked, is when you can rent a car. And so they do a little better. But regardless, the idea is that we all say it's an adult. And so what those kind of binary terms do is they obscure the fact that, yeah, but underneath, we actually still don't have a proper understanding of what's going on. And so by saying that something is or isn't intelligent, what you're basically assuming is that somewhere, some developmental biologist can tell you what happened from the time that you were an oocyte, a little blob of chemicals that presumably was well handled by biochemistry and physics. And then eventually, well, now you're the subject of physiology. And then eventually you're the subject of developmental biology. And then, oh, look, now you're the subject of behavior science. Oh, wait, psychoanalysis. So like each of us made that journey. It's a smooth, continuous journey. Developmental biology offers no support for this idea that somewhere there's a bright, flash of light and that, okay, now you used to be just chemistry, but now you've got a real mind. Like that never happens.
How does he know that never happens? How does he know? There are many situations where you do, in fact, have this binary, and I think he refers to one in a moment. The phase change is a simple example from physics, chemistry. There is a moment at which solids melt into liquids. There's a temperature. Okay, it happens sort of slowly, more gradually, but that's not to change the fact there is a melting point and there is a boiling point, and either side of which you have predominantly solid and then predominantly liquid. There can be categorical, qualitatively binary differences between things, and there can be continuums as well, where there's just a grayscale or a spectrum. We don't have to privilege one over the other, but it seems to me like Michael is very insistent on this idea that we endorse the continuum because we can't point to a place either side of this line where a thing either is a thing or isn't a thing. But physics and chemistry and science in general is replete with this kind of thing. Dogs are not cats, but there is certainly a continuum of species between dogs and cats. You go back through until you reach a common ancestor. Electrons aren't quarks. Water isn't oil. There's lots of things where there's not a continuum. And just because you can't point to a moment where on this side we don't have a mind and on this side we do have a mind, doesn't mean that therefore you give up any notion that a mind is a useful thing to investigate and some things have minds and some things don't.
Because here's the other thing they do. If I were to say that it's a continuum, right? If cognition is a continuum from the most primitive passive matter to, humans and above, what I could say is I'm going to take some tools from behavioral neuroscience and I'm going to apply them to all kinds of weird things and see how that works out for me. And that's how we're going to know what's cognitive and what's not. And this, in fact, is what my lab is doing. That project is very disruptive. And there are a lot of people who really think that's crazy.
It's not crazy, but it does beg the question. Because if you begin with the assumption that you're going to apply the tools of cognition to science, and you're assuming, your beginning assumption is, well, you're he'll come to this, a panpsychist of a kind, and everything has intelligence, or at least all living things, perhaps non-living things have intelligence as well, and they have memory and they have consciousness, all these things. Then that begs the question, because he just asked what is cognitive and what isn't. Well, everything is because you're using the tools of cognition. So you're never going to solve the problem of what a cognition is because you're just saying, well, it's all cognition. Everything has some amount of it if it's solving a problem, for example. So we never get to the point of actually engaging with the question. You're solving a different question to what other people are trying to solve, which is what is human cognition? What is this capacity to problem solve? What is this capacity to create knowledge? How is it that we come to understand all the rest of physical reality in the way that we humans uniquely do? All of that stuff is still left as an open question, which is not touched on at all by Michael Levin's research. What he's talking about is something different, which he's just using the labels of cognition, intelligence, creativity, consciousness in order, and all the tools, the language of psychoanalysis and psychology to talk about things like worms or artificial intelligence or perhaps even molecules as well.
Because what they will say is, look, it's a category error. Brains and humans think, cells and tissues can't think. How do you know? Well, because the way the word is defined. Right? So what they've done is they've taken something that's actually should be an empirical experimental science, take the tools and see where they give you benefits and where they don't. But instead, they've made it into a philosophical or linguistic project where these ancient categories that we got saddled with, oh, don't make a category error, that kind of thing. So I think it's very disruptive. So I think what's going to happen...
It is disruptive, but just notice the move that's been made there, the discursive move, if you like. There are these people over there, call them psychologists or philosophers, epistemologists, psychoanalysts, all of these people who talk about things like, well, everything in psychology, cognition, intelligence, creativity, all of that stuff. They've been studying this in order to try and understand the human mind for a long time. And so they use the word mind as well, and memory and all learning and whatever else. Michael Levin comes along and he goes, I'm going to repurpose that language and apply it to everything in order to solve problems. Fine, okay, disruptive, as he says. But then he complains that those very same people that are doing this work over there to try and understand the human mind are saying to him, what you're doing over there is a category error because we are trying to understand the mind, which is a very different thing to all of that other stuff. And he comes back and says, oh, well, this is what is holding up research in all of these different areas. What he's doing is a different thing, though. He's not researching the human brain and human cognition. He's not trying to answer that question. He's trying to answer a different question about simpler biological organisms and perhaps everything else. And what is similar, crucially, what is similar between these biological organisms and perhaps people, which we can all admit. He's looking at the similarities, but many of us are interested in the differences. We want to know what it is that makes the qualitative binary distinction between people and everything else. And Michael might very well say, there is no such thing. There is no line, sharp, bright line that we can draw either side. And I will just say, there certainly is. Explanatory universality is a binary. Universality, broadly speaking, is a binary. That a computer has a different sort of, and I always have to emphasize this these days because there's been some misconception over this. Certainly when I first learned about this, I was laboring under a misconception as well. Hardware universality is a binary thing as well. Computational universality, Turing universality is a different thing. A computer either can simulate any physical process. A computer can either do the work of literally any other computer, or it can't. They're your two options. Okay? Either it can do anything physically possible, simulate anything physically possible, or it can't. There's no grayscale between those. If you have a computer that can do 1,000 things, and a computer that can do 1 billion things, and a computer that can do 1 trillion things, all of those are equally far away from the machine that can do literally anything. Because the machine that can do literally anything has an infinite repertoire. And that's a binary, and it's an important binary. And in the same way, human cognition comes down to a binary. The difference between the entity that can understand anything in principle, not in practice, the entity that can create knowledge about can create an explanation about any physical process, anywhere in the universe, can come to understand any physical process. Either you can do that thing or you can't. We have a mind that is insufficient to do that. So that's the interesting problem for psychologists, computer scientists, AGI researchers, etc., etc. They're engaged in that project, and they have a language that they've developed over time. It's almost as if we were to have a different researcher, not Michael Levin, who was to come along and let's say they're a psychologist. And they're a psychologist and they decide to look at physics, and they're envious of physics, and they go, I'm going to repurpose the language that's used over there in physics. I'm going to start talking about psychological force fields and particles in the mind. But these are not literal physical particles. They're not like electrons and atoms and stuff. There's something else, okay? We're talking about a sociological particle or a psychological particle. You could do that, but the physicists are going to have a sideways look at you and go, No, a particle is a fundamental, indivisible unit that we talk about in areas of physics, in the Standard Model, and so on and so forth. And whatever you're talking about over there with your particles in psychology, they're not like our particles here. So too with Michael Levin, perhaps. So too here, that he might say that, you know, people are accusing him of category errors, and he's very upset at people telling him that. But he could just, I could just concede, okay, everything he's doing and talking about, thinking about, researching and whatever, all very useful. And he can use that language if he likes, but it's just not the same kind of thing as the researcher in psychology looking at cognition. It really isn't. Because if a rat or a flatworm is engaged in cognition, okay, but it is a categorically different thing to the kind of cognition done by a person, because a person is not just coming up with mathematical models or predictions, but explanations of physical reality in explicit terms, using language, perhaps using diagrams and whatever else. They can run podcasts like this. The flatworm isn't. It's not just that the flatworm is quantitatively slightly less capable of running a podcast and talking about the work of Michael Levin. It's that they are unable to, it's inconceivable how they could even begin to approximate that thing, the same as a rat. This is common sense, but yeah, sometimes we need to recall what reality is all about.
So I think what's going to happen in the future is that all of the applications now that are coming out from active matter research, from basal cognition, from work in slime molds and single cells and materials with learning capacity and all this stuff, we're going to realize, I think, this is, you know, again, one of these claims, I think that we're going to realize neuroscience is not about neurons at all. Okay. And what neuroscience is really about is cognitive glue. Neuroscience is the question of what kind of architectures add up to larger scale minds from aligned, simpler components. Now, neuroscience has a lot to teach us about that because that's basically what they've been studying. But I think the majority of them, not everybody, because we have all kinds of collaborators in this field who are doing something else, but the vast majority of traditional neuroscience think they're studying neurons, that this is something unique to these, you know, cellular systems that they're studying. And I think this field of diverse intelligence combines artificial intelligence and engineering and cybernetics and evolutionary biology and AI and exobiology, right? In the search for alien life, like all of these things are together asking, what are actually the common threads of being an agent, no matter what your origin story, whether you were designed or evolved or, you know, engineered or evolved, or whether you were made of squishy proteins or whether you were, you know, made of silicon or something else, right? I don't know. I think science fiction prepares you for that nicely, for that kind of stuff.
That I have no problem with. I know, it segued from what I didn't understand to something that I think is a reasonable question. What is it, in terms of architecture, if you want to put it that way, that would unite human beings and their capacity to understand the universe with alien intelligence out there, which can do the same thing, with an AGI, a silicon entity that could do the same thing? Now, we're all people. And it's something I talk about all the time, okay, with this idea of the general intelligence, explanatory universality, okay? That is an interesting question, and that's all about cognition and everything. So he admits there that this is the really interesting question. Okay, but that is quite separate from why does a worm grow two heads when an electric field is applied to it? I think that these are separate things, and we just keep them separate. Maybe we can find some connections, but there's no point confusing things. Just talk about the important work being done with the two-headed worm and the regrowing of stuff and electrical fields and all that sort of thing. We can just talk about electrical potentials. We can talk about the memory that is kept inside of those electric fields, or wherever else it happens to be kept. Okay, maybe that's an open question. Where is this memory being kept if it's not inside the genome? It's inside this electric field somehow. That's great. That's all very useful. But it's a separate question, and it doesn't need to be on a continuum with explanatory universality.
And so I think neuroscience has a couple of black clouds. And I'll just describe one of them. Karina Kaufman and I, she's an amazing. She started as a high school student working with me remotely. We just did a review of this. Clinical cases in humans of normal or above normal IQ while having very minimal brain volume. I'm sure you've heard some of these cases, but there are many to look at.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it's not that you can't add a bunch of epicycles to standard neuroscience and somehow try to squeeze these things into the mainstream paradigm. Maybe you can, but to me, the most important thing is that it doesn't predict that that should be possible. There's nothing we learn, at least that I've ever seen in neuroscience courses, that tells you that, oh, and by the way, yeah, you should be able to do all this with like less than a third of the brain volume of a chimpanzee. So there's something going on here, which I think is really fundamental. It's one of these like, observations that you can try to sweep under the rug, but I think is actually telling you that we have some very, very seriously wrong assumptions somewhere in the theory.
I've looked at some of that research, or in some cases, brain adaptations around severe injury.
Yeah.
And they just raised a lot more questions than we can currently answer. This could be a quagmire I'm about to create, but I'm going to take a stab at it anyway. A lot of people talk about consciousness maybe in the same way that people argue about God without defining it very well. But then even the best intentions to define it can end up slipping on banana peels.
This is an interesting sort of schism that I don't think either of them recognize. On the one hand, Michael Levin is very, I would say, adverse to any kind of definition. Tim Ferriss is very keen on being fixated on definitions, on settling on the definitions. And these are two very different approaches that I think Popper is right in the middle of. Popper does not say, just do away with words altogether. We need to be able to communicate, after all. In order to solve problems, we have to be able to express ourselves in language. And in order to communicate, we have to have some sort of mutual understanding of each other. But debating the meaning of words, just doing that all day, every day, is not going to enable you to make any progress whatsoever. And settling on your definitions doesn't necessarily enable you to make progress either. We can talk about consciousness without actually defining what it is, by saying that, well, it is something that it's like to be a person, the first person perspective. And that's all that Michael Levin's going to do, by the way. He's just going to explain consciousness in different words without actually... So no one solves consciousness, right? Now, no one has got this solution, so it's no criticism of him that he doesn't either. But Michael Levin doesn't seem to like definitions. He wants to turn everything into a continuum. So there's no real definition of consciousness because everything has it. What is it that everything has? Consciousness. But what is consciousness? Well, the first person perspective on things. So an electron has consciousness? Well, yeah. How do you know the electron has consciousness? Well, you just assert it, right? On the other hand, you could say that, well, you agree with the computational theory of consciousness, which is that once you reach a certain level of brain complexity, then this thing arises where the entity is able to have a sense of itself, or it's able to actually experience pain and suffering, or it's able to sense its environment in some way from a first-person subjective experience. So there are a number of other theories that are try to grapple with this consciousness, but they're the two most famous ones. Either everything has consciousness because we can't draw a line either side of things that are unconscious and things that are conscious that everyone will agree on. So therefore we'll just say everything has it. Or we go the way that I just prefer as a matter of taste, which is that human beings are absolutely conscious. You need a nervous system in order to be conscious, because you need sense organs in order to be conscious. And that creates a representation in the brain of the rest of physical reality, which you can have a first-person sense of, and therefore only things with brains can possibly be conscious. And perhaps it's just the case that only things that can create explanatory models of the rest of reality can be conscious, and that would be people and nothing else. But I'm willing to concede maybe there are other levels of consciousness in other animals, things with nervous systems, but I'm not going to attribute consciousness of that kind to a tree, or much less to a rock, and certainly not an electron. But anyway, there is this weird distinction between the two where Tim is keen on settling on definitions before progress is made, and Michael saying definitions are the very thing that get in the road of making progress.
But I am curious. You've spent time with Daniel Dennett, who I think you mentioned a little bit earlier. We're talking about, and I think you can keep most people probably on the same page when you're talking about intelligence as very carefully defined in a specific way, right? And I'm paraphrasing here from memory, so I apologize if I get it wrong, but goal-seeking systems that maybe can satisfy those goals in multiple ways. Maybe this is kind of along William James' lines.
If your definition of intelligence is something like a goal-seeking system that can find solutions in multiple ways or something like that, why not just say that that's what you research? I research goal-seeking systems and the commonalities and differences between them. That would be okay, uncontroversial. Because then you go, well, you can say that, well, a cell has a goal, survival or something like that, or the gene has a goal, survival. Now, it's not the goal that people would normally talk about, but I think that's less controversial. Something that is exploring a solution space, something like that. And then you don't have this loaded kind of term of intelligence and then say, I'm an intelligence researcher, and so therefore I research worms and cells because they're intelligent too. And then you get into all these debates about words, which is exactly the thing that Popper would want to avoid. But if you want to go that way, I suppose, it's fine. As I say again, it's fine if you want to do that. I think you're leaving yourself open to criticism that is just going to be distracting. If you were to say goal-seeking systems, problem-solving systems, something like that, I don't know. It might help, but then again, it might not. But I just feel like we're conflating different things. And once you start conflating, which is hiding the differences, focusing only on the similarities, you lose the interesting problem.
Feel free to fact check that. But I'm wondering where you go from there, or how you think about consciousness, if you do at all. Maybe that's just one of those terms. It's like, well, it's like success or happiness. It's like so poorly defined. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it because it's a dead end. But if that's not the case, how do you think about consciousness? Because as you're talking, and some people may have been thinking this, they're like, well, wait a second. Is Mike a panpsychist? Is like, where are we going here?
Yeah. Oh, I'm a, I don't know, some sort of super panpsychist or something.
You can't be a super panpsychist. I'm going to be a pedant on this. Panpsychists believe everything is conscious. Everything. Maybe even time and space itself is conscious. All subatomic particles are conscious. Pan means everything. It's like being endorsing the idea of explanatory universality. You can't be a super universal explainer. You're a universal explainer or you're not. Maybe you can be slightly faster, but that would just be a faster universal explainer, not some sort of super different kind of universal explainer. There are universal explainers or not. There are panpsychists or not. To say you're a super panpsychist, I don't know, it's just trying to differentiate yourself from all those other people who are panpsychists without actually explaining what is the difference. But panpsychists is people who think that everything is conscious and you just add up the consciousnesses and you get to something that is human like us, and we have a special kind of consciousness, not qualitatively, just quantitatively. We can experience a wider repertoire of conscious experiences. But dogs have slightly less, and rats have slightly less, and cockroaches and cells, and ultimately you get down to fundamental particles.
I don't think it's unimportant. I think it's a very important question, big picture. Like, I think it's really important. I'm not a consciousness researcher, and in my lab, we haven't done pretty much any experiments on consciousness. So I want to preface everything I'm about to say by saying that, first of all, this is not something I typically work on. And the reason I don't work on it right now, and I do have some stuff cooking, but it's sort of not ready yet for public consumption. The reason I don't focus on it now is that there's so much that can be done without delving into that, with a third person perspective on observable problem solving, cognition. And even that has been such a slog. I've been at this for now, 20 years, and it's been so difficult to get people to shift in that way. Like, I don't need to get into consciousness to do the things that I need to do now. Nevertheless, and so for that practical, strategic reason, I haven't been talking about it, except for when people ask. And so if you ask, I would say that for the purposes of defining what we're talking about now, I would say simply something like first-person perspective of the kind that makes my toothache really quite different in import than anybody else's toothache. There's something about my toothache that's quite different than when other people, like, it's terrible when other people have a toothache, but there's something different when I have it. And so that's, I think, the kind of thing that we're talking about here. So here's what I would say about it. First of all, again, I really can't understand how anybody can maintain a binary view about this, both on an evolutionary scale and on a developmental scale. If you think you are conscious, and I realize that some people don't even think that, but let's assume that we think that we are conscious, you have to tell me when that showed up in development. Development is slow and gradual. And either the oocyte had something that got scaled up in some way, and then what we really owe is a story of scaling, which is what I think, or something, some sort of, people will say, phase transition. And that's a fine hypothesis. You have to show me what the phase transition is and why I can't zoom into it. Because the nice thing about those graphs that goes like this is that if you just stretch the horizontal axis, they all become smooth and flat eventually.
There's an open question. We don't know what consciousness is. And just because you can't point to a specific place in the development from an oocyte through to an adult human doesn't mean that there isn't such a place. Your lack of ability to imagine where the dividing line is does not discount the fact there could be a dividing line no one knows about. Now, I don't know. I don't know if the panpsychists aren't correct. I doubt it. I think that the computational idea is a more scientifically robust one because it doesn't require us to posit any additional things, forces or properties of subatomic particles. We can just work within the existing framework of physics. No new physics is required. It's just an open question as to what a mind is. In other words, if we slowly wind back the clock, if I was to wind back the clock on my own aging, I know that I'm conscious now and I was conscious yesterday, and let's keep on winding the clock back. I have memories of what it was like of when I was 5 years old. I know I was conscious then. Now, much before that, I don't have much of a memory of. There's some hazy things, and I think everyone is kind of like this. Now, there's a point at which your memory definitely ceases to be. You can't remember certain things. I guess most people don't remember being born. But prior to the age of 5, maybe there was a line. Now, I have argued that this line may well appear when the baby is a fetus at some point. Now, I can't point to the exact moment, but why can't it be the case that a literal piece of software, a program, runs on this brain, and that brain develops over time, and it's incomplete. Its capacity to explain the world is incomplete at the moment of conception up to, let's say, 5 months. Let's say 5 months, okay, as that thing grows. As the human embryo grows into a fetus, it doesn't know anything. It can't create anything. The brain is undeveloped. It can't experience anything either. But there comes a day, perhaps an hour, perhaps a minute, perhaps a second, when effectively the lines of code have actually been written onto the brain, and the brain wakes up, illuminates, much like a light going on. The lights come on literally. People often talk about this as consciousness is the place where the universe is illuminated. The lights are on with you at the moment, and you are aware of things. Why is it so hard to believe that this could actually be what goes on in the development of a human being? That somewhere between the moment of conception and, I will even grant, let's say 1 year old, the lights come on, and it is a very fast thing. We don't know where that is right now, but we may well find the day where we find that happens. And because of issues like abortion and so on, I say that we have to err on the side of caution. And so therefore I go 5 months, 4 months, something like that. Somewhere around that time, the lights come on for a human being. Now, I could be wrong about that. It might be much later. Or I could be completely wrong, and Michael might be right. There is no possible way to draw a line because everything is conscious all the way down to the zygote, and then maybe the sperm and ova are conscious in some way. And then, again, maybe single atoms and molecules and electrons are conscious. Maybe that's true. I can imagine both. I don't understand why Michael thinks that the drawing of the line is just unimaginable. You just can't imagine how it could possibly be so. Why not? I can imagine that consciousness stretches all the way through to fundamental particles and off to, entire superclusters of galaxies, if you like, because I don't really know what consciousness is. I know it's the subjective experience, like you said. But saying consciousness is the capacity to have a subjective experience, or it is the subjective experience, just is using two words that you're not solving anything by using these words to explain that word. So let's keep going.
So like, what exactly happened that you weren't conscious and then you began? Like, I think that's a total non-starter. So I think,
why is it a non-starter? What exactly happened when I did this and then did that? I'm turning the lights on and off, right? Well, we can actually explain what goes on with the closing of the circuit and the movement of electrons drifting through a wire, an electric field traveling all the way through to the filament in certain lights or into LEDs and so on, and then them glowing, electrons being converted into light. Well, okay, why can't we imagine that something similar might happen with a mind, where the lights are off, 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 and then suddenly a switch is turned and consciousness, creativity, and problem solving and understanding and explanation and all these things, free will, all get switched on together? Why? Genes get switched on. Things, they literally talk about switching or a phase change. Why not?
the question about consciousness is what kind and how much. So let's just start there. And then I would say that there are roughly 4 reasons why people give each other the benefit of the doubt about consciousness, right? So the problem of other minds, how do I know that you're conscious? Yeah, there's usually about 4 types of reasons that people give. What I can say is that if you like any of those reasons, for any of those 4 reasons, you should take very seriously, for example, the idea that other organs in your body have their own consciousness. For those exact same reasons, for the same reason, we can dive into it if you want.
It's not the exact same reason. The liver or another part of your body is not able to explain anything. It doesn't have explanatory universality. Now, that is a theory I've proposed. It's a theory David Deutsch proposed. Neither of us believe it. I don't believe it. I don't know. It's just an open question. But it's quite possible that the capacity to explain things provides you with what it's like to be conscious, and what it's vice versa. If you are conscious insofar as you're able to explain the environment in which you find yourself. I don't mean implicitly explain, I mean explicitly. Talk about it and write stuff down. Communicate. It could be at a very crude level. You know, Neanderthal man would have had trouble actually constructing these explanations, but explanations indeed they had, created in their mind. That could be the key, that this ability to represent physical reality out there in a one-to-one way, as I say, this self-similarity between the rest of physical reality and your brains. And no matter how crude the explanation is, if an explanation can be constructed, then that thing is conscious. Now, do I believe this? No. I don't know whether panpsychism or the regular computational idea of consciousness, namely that things with a nervous system have consciousness and only things with a nervous system. All of these are still on the table. I don't know why Michael would want to rule any of them out right now. But, you know, he has this thing for continuums. Everything's on a continuum. Intelligence is on a continuum. Agency is on a continuum. Consciousness is on a continuum. So we've got all these appeals to continua.
But for the same reasons that you and I think each other is conscious, you should take very seriously the idea that there are other parts of your body that are. Now, at this point, people usually say, well, that's weird. I don't feel my liver being conscious. Right. Your left hemisphere that's verbal puts up a very nice story about how it's the only one that's conscious. And of course, you don't feel your liver being conscious. You also don't feel me being conscious. That's because you are not that consciousness. But that doesn't mean that there aren't.
No, but Michael Levin can give an account of himself. Every other person can give an account for themselves to explain what it's like. And if the thing can't give an account of itself as to what it's like, then it might have a different sort of consciousness. Now, it might be the case that, you know, you're a baby and you're conscious, but you can't actually explain it. But the best explanation, okay, that human beings are conscious applies therefore to babies. And if you want to get down the computational route, then we just say things with a nervous system. So therefore dogs are conscious, cows are conscious and that kind of thing, because maybe they experience the world in some way. But they can't explain it, in which case my other theory would be wrong, but the computational one would be right. But panpsychism would be wrong if it's only nervous systems. Now, I don't know why. I can't explain it, but, you know, I'm in no better position of being able to explain why only entities with nervous systems can be conscious, for whatever reason, then Michael is able to explain why panpsychism should be correct and that everything is conscious. Okay, that seems a logically coherent position to many people. And it is logically coherent. You can have that. You just add up the consciousness that particles have, and you eventually get to this higher order consciousness that human beings possess. But again, even if you said that, even if you were able to say that, it doesn't solve the problem of what people are and how they achieve the magnificent things that they achieve, which is, again, what I'm interested in.
Any number of other consciousnesses inhabiting your body, and you would not have primary access to them. Some people disagree, but that's what I think. So I think that we should take very seriously the idea that certainly all kinds of other minimal biologicals have some degree of, I'm not saying, every cell is sitting there having, hopes and dreams like we are, but little ones, right? Little tiny ones. That I think I can say reason.
Well, that's interesting that the cells don't have hopes and dreams like we do, but little ones. They do have little hopes and dreams. And that's very interesting. Because no matter how small this hope and dream is, this conscious experience is, it would seem to me it would need to be represented somewhere. And so that would be an interesting open problem, because then you would have to look for where the memory is stored in those cells. And this may connect with what Michael is doing with the worms. Okay, the cell or the worm has an electric field, and the electric field can store memory of some kind. Okay. Whether or not that can amount to a hope and a dream is another thing. That might be a stretch. And it's this use of language to anthropomorphize things that are not people concerns me. And it concerns me just for moral reasons, because I want to exalt the human being, the importance and uniqueness of the human being. And if we start to lose the capacity to talk sensibly about what makes people unique, we lose something really important. The ability to talk about the problem of what people are, what a universal explainer is, what the code might be, and how a person is unique. But this is just common across, I'm seeing it so much more in science and technology and everywhere. Again, I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. The AI researchers want to say there's nothing special about people. We're just a special kind of AI. We might be a large language model of a kind. And superintelligence is coming that will make us seem like ants in their presence. So they've got an anti-human kind of bent. There's nothing special about people in their view. Certain scientific rationalists say, well, we're just a chimpanzee, and we're compelled to behave in certain ways because we're genetically pre-programmed. And so therefore we should look to evolutionary psychology in order to explain why it is that people behave a certain way, because we're no different to all the other animals that operate just according to instinct as well. And here Michael Levin is taking just another view. All the language that we normally associate with people, creativity, hopes, dreams, predicting, maybe even enjoying life and whatever else you wanted to call it, explaining, creating, being intelligent, cognition, all of these words can be used to describe literally any other system, all the way down to a single cell. There's nothing special about people. It's the appeal to that again. But I'm interested in what makes people. It's obvious to everyone. It's obvious if you just sit down for 30 seconds and reflect on what you do each day, where you go. You drive in a car off to a magnificent building somewhere that has air conditioning, that exists in a society governed by laws and traditions that have existed across centuries and evolved into this magnificent civilization where we just make progress ever faster every single year, creating more and more technologies and enabling us to live longer and have brilliant scientists like Michael Levin figure out more about the mysteries of the universe. And then for him to come along and say, but never mind all that. We're just like the cells that make up the rest of us. No, there's something different, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively. And if you take away the terminology that we use to describe all this stuff, the rest of us who are really interested in this are going to really struggle to communicate with you about what the mystery is at the heart of what it is to be a person. Because mystery it remains until people make progress on this AGI thing, or just what a human mind can do and how it does it.
The thing that is a total conjecture is the following, something that I've said more recently. Just this year, I've started talking about this notion of this Platonic space. And if you want to talk about that, we can get into it. But I think that in many ways, all the things that we are looking at, so bodies, computers, robots, embryos, the biobots, all of those things are in an important sense thin clients. They're front-end interfaces for patterns of behavior, patterns of information processing, patterns of form, and so on, for patterns that come from a different space. They don't come from this physical space, and we can dig into that. If that's the case, then what you could say is, and again, this is just conjecturing here, I'm not saying this is like useful in the lab yet or anything like that. I like to keep those things separate. But if you had to say something about consciousness, what you might say is that consciousness is the point of view of the pattern projecting into the physical space. In other words, third person observable behavior, problem solving, like normal science, is what we see with each other doing within the space. But consciousness is the viewpoint of the pattern that is fundamentally, like you and I on that view and many other things, are fundamentally patterns that live in this other space. And we sometimes project through various interfaces like physical bodies, robots, androids, whatever, machines, embryos. We sometimes project through these physical interfaces, and consciousness is what it is like, the experience that it is like to be one of those patterns projecting into space.
Okay, I don't think it adds anything at all. It raises more questions than it answers, but it's fine. Again, with all these theories of consciousness, as he readily admits there, it's not useful for the lab there. But if you were to postulate this Platonic realm, where this realm of mathematics, there are patterns, and we are one such pattern that actually exists there. Okay, it's getting very mystical, very spiritual. And we project ourselves into the physical realm in some way, and so therefore consciousness is what it's like for the pattern in the Platonic realm to manifest itself in the physical realm. Then we have questions about, how exactly does this projection work? What way in which it would be tested? And I think it might come to this presently, but it's this question about. I think he gets to Descartes. And let's see. I'm getting ahead of myself.
That's one way you might think about it.
Could you explain that again, as if I'm a smart sixth grader, very interested in technical stuff? And I suppose what I'm trying to triangulate on is, are you getting into kind of Donald Hoffman territory of sort of reality as user interface? I'd love to hear you explain the other space, or not coming from physical space, just maybe to put it a different way.
Sure. Okay. Let's run through it. I think Don's work is very interesting. For the purposes of what I'm about to say, we don't need to worry about it.
Good. Donald Hoffman is another person that I now and again are asked to talk about or to do a reaction to. I've done enough on Donald Hoffman. I've listened to enough of Donald Hoffman. There are a few of these iconoclastic contemporary thinkers that say interesting things and then go into areas that I don't understand. And so I have these two articles. One, Donald Hoffman, where I agree with him. He says sensible things about, we exist in virtual reality as part of our minds, is precisely what David Deutsch says in The Fabric of Reality. Perfectly sensible stuff. Perfectly sensible. That we take seriously the idea that we are software. The mind is software, and therefore it doesn't have direct access to reality. It can only construct knowledge of reality. So he kind of says all these things. And then he shifts from that to this grand metaphysical ontology, okay? In other words, an ultimate explanation for all of reality, that in fact, basically everything is kind of a simulation, and we are these programs that exist inside the simulation, and so on. And so that idea, which again, kind of, it's metaphysical, and so it also purports to be a theory, a final theory of everything. And I don't like final theories of that try and say they're about everything. If they get far away from the ability to be tested, he reckons he can test it, but again, he's one of these scientists, which is why I kind of stopped listening to him. And there are a few of these that are out there, especially on social media, of forever promising that the paper is coming where they're going to tell you what the experiment is that will enable you to test the veracity of their theory. And it just never comes through. They just never publish the thing. And he's also got this thing that if he can, from within his theory, mathematically predict the content of quantum theory and general relativity from his theory, this is Donald Hoffman, then somehow this will provide mathematical proof that his theory must be correct. I don't think he's yet succeeded in unifying general relativity and quantum mechanics with his theory of consciousness, but that's the claim, right? He has a theory of consciousness that unites general relativity and quantum theory. Everything else, a lot of other, well, I shouldn't say everything, a lot of other stuff he says is quite sensible.
Let's assume a perfectly conventional physics. I think Don's onto something, I think for sure, but let's assume that we don't need to worry about that, a perfectly conventional physics. One thing that scientists nowadays like is a view called physicalism. Physicalism says that, look, there's only one realm that we need to worry about. It's this physical realm. Physics tells us everything you need to know about this realm. And there it is. A lot of people like that, but I actually think that view is a non-starter for the following reason. There are all kinds of important facts that are simply not facts about physics. They are not discovered by physicists. They will never be discovered by physicists. They are not changed by anything we do in physics. And those are certain facts of mathematics. So for example, the exact value of E, the natural logarithm, the fact that complex numbers behave differently than quaternions, that behave differently than octonions under certain, right? Like, you know, the truths of number theory, certain facts of topology, and the distribution of prime numbers. You can't just dissolve the math department and hope that, don't worry, the physicists will figure out why this is.
It's true. I don't know why there's this obsession with what physicists might say or whatever. So I suppose I have that to some extent. But yeah, one version of physicalism is, physics can explain everything. I don't know. But that's naive and silly and whatever else. But that physics has some sort of primacy in constraining what matter can do, including what our brains can do or what our brains can even think, is true. Our brains obey physical laws. If physical laws mandate that certain computations can't be done, then therefore certain things can't be thought, because thinking is a form of computation going on inside the brain. And if the laws of physics don't allow the computation to be made, then you're never able to think of the thing. So in a very real way, there are constraints upon what we're able to think mandated by the laws of physics. Now, I by definition, I can't think of a thing that would fit that, because you can't think things that the laws of physics won't allow you to think. But if the laws of physics were different, you could think different things, because the laws of computation would be different as well. Physicalism might also just be described as that position, not allowing metaphysical, religious, spiritual, mystical ideas to contaminate what you think about how reality operates. Reality operates according to physical laws. Now, if you think reality operates according to physical laws, you might call yourself a physicalist. If you say that everything can be explained in terms of physics, you might also call yourself physicalist. So this word maybe is not that useful, but it's certainly wrong to say that physics is the only game in town. I've said that before. Okay, obviously physics is not economics. It's not going to help you in economics. It's not going to help you in history very much. It's not even going to necessarily, if you're a quantum physicist, that doesn't mean you're going to understand organic chemistry all that well. There are these emergent laws and emergent explanations, and explanations at different levels. And, you know, mathematics is one thing. If our understanding of the laws of physics change, that won't change the truths of mathematics. But remember, mathematics is not a royal road to necessary truth. What mathematics is the area of our understanding and investigation where we create knowledge about necessary truth. Necessary truth is not the reward we get for doing mathematics. So even though it's about a Platonic realm of, you know, transcendental truth and, you know, eternal truth, or however you want to put that, what we get is knowledge of that, not the truth.
This is not what they will ever do. The math department does things that are different and additive to what physics does. And both in physics and biology, and I think in cognitive science too, there's an interesting phenomenon, which is that if you're like a 5-year-old and you do that thing where you keep asking, but why, right? So this is but why? If you keep asking, but why long enough, eventually you always end up in the math department.
No, you don't. Again, this is the hierarchy, the misconceived hierarchy again. That mathematics is the most fundamental, then physics builds on that, then physical chemistry, then organic chemistry, then biology, then psychology, then sociology, economics, and whatever else. But this hierarchy, this idea of a hierarchy or a pyramid or whatever, where there's a basis and you build and construct, and it's just misconceived. Different subject areas can have their own fundamental theories. Then there's a fundamental theory in biology, evolution by natural selection, which operates the way that it does, yes, because the laws of physics allow it. As Michael says, indeed, biology is that realm where it exploits what physics allows. But you don't always, if you keep asking but why, you don't always end up in the maths department. You often end up with the answer, or you should rationally end up with the answer, I don't know. But if you think asking but why, in terms of why the Second World War happened, you're not going to always end up in the maths department. And you shouldn't expect to either. And even in physics, although he's going to use an example here, even in physics, it's not everything is the way it is in physical reality, or at least it would be better to say no one knows if the reason why things are the way they are in physical reality is because they are manifesting a necessary mathematical truth and there's no other possible way things could have been. One purported solution to the fine-tuning problem why the laws of physics and the universe is the way that it is because some people say, well, whatever the ultimate laws of physics are, ultimate, whatever that could mean, will turn out to require, as a matter of mathematical necessity, the laws of physics and reality to be the way that it is. But that's the only time I think that people genuinely argue that kind of thing.
Up in the math department, it's the damnedest thing. Like imagine cicadas, right? They come out every 13 and 17 years or something, they come out, right? And you say, hey, why is that? The biologist says, hey, why is that? Because that way they don't time their predators. Because if it was every 12 years, then every 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, 6-year predator would get you, right? So 13 and 17, like, that's cool. Why are those numbers so special? They're prime numbers. Yeah, but why 13 and 17? Why isn't there one in between? Now you got to go to the math department, right? Because they're the only ones that understand why that is. So
that's confirmation. What we should do is look for a refutation of this idea that we always end up in the mathematics department. Did Hitler really kill himself or not? Did he escape to Argentina? We're not going to end up in the maths department to settle that. Okay, anyway.
It's like this with everything. With physics, you keep digging, but why do the fermions do this or that? Oh, because this like amplitude-hedron has like this symmetry group or whatever. So there's something interesting going on where even from the most basic math that you learn in high school up through these very complicated things, there are a bunch of facts that are simply not facts of physics.
Yeah.
This, I think, is just how it is. Now, from here, you have a choice to make. You could say, well, these are just random regularities that are true in our world. It's just a random grab bag of interesting things. Mathematicians don't treat it that way, right? They think it's an ordered structured space that they are exploring. Especially Platonist mathematicians think they are discovering, they're not inventing. You don't have a choice. You start with set theory, eventually you find out the value of E. You didn't have a choice about that. Like, that's what you found out.
I agree, but this is this old thing that many people talk about. And is mathematics invented or discovered, created or discovered? My answer to this always and remains kind of along the lines that Michael is talking about there, that yes, mathematicians are discovering truths, uncovering facts, better, uncovering explanations. What they're doing is creating knowledge of mathematics, which enables them to say, I've discovered something new. It's exactly like the kind of way that explorers of the past, they had to build the ship first, and then they were able to discover the new continent or the new island or whatever it is. But they had to create the thing first. So mathematicians are creating knowledge of the underlying truth. And that knowledge is error prone. Humans are fallible, that kind of thing. So you may discover, but you're not discovering the truth. You're creating knowledge of the truth. It's a nice, clean way to explain what's going on here. The reward you get is knowledge of mathematics, not necessary truth. That's the subject matter.
Like, that's what you found out. You discovered that. So I think more optimistically that this is not a random grab bag of stuff. This is some kind of structured space of patterns, mathematical patterns. Now you can take one other step and you say, interesting, how do we know that these patterns are only of relevance to math? Is it possible? Well, we know they're of relevance to physics because they constrain how physics go. What about biology? Well, biology is interesting. Imagine that there was some planet, and on this planet, the highest fitness belongs to a triangle of a very specific shape, okay? So here comes evolution, and it cranks a bunch of generations, and it finds the first angle. Cool. And it cranks a bunch more generations, finds the second angle. Does it need to do it again to find the third angle? Why no? Because once you know two angles of the triangle, you know the third one. Why did evolution just get to save 1/3 of the time that it would take to figure this out? Why you get a free gift from mathematics? And so I think that physics is what we call things that are constrained by these patterns.
I didn't understand that. Because again, it raises more questions. If there's a biological organism where the highest fitness is a triangle of a certain kind, and it finds one angle and finds another angle, then it doesn't need to find that. Well, of course it needs to find the third angle. Just as a school student or any other person who is asked to find the third angle, you have to go 180 degrees, take away the other two. But that's on the assumption of Euclidean geometry. What if, what if we're thinking of a world which doesn't obey Euclidean geometry? Like the real world, you know, the real space out there may not very well be flat in the way that Euclidean geometry demands, and real physical triangles or biological organisms made of triangles might not actually have a 180 take away these two. Anyway, so I'm not really sure what the point was there.
Biology are the things that are enabled or facilitated by these patterns. I think biology uses the hell out of these things, and we'll talk about what they are momentarily. But now you say, okay, so they're relevant in physics, they're relevant in biology. What kinds of patterns are there? Well, there are passive things like the value of E and some fractals and things like that. But could it be that there are other patterns in this space that look a lot like things that are not studied by mathematicians? Maybe they look a lot like things that are studied by behavioral scientists. Could they be patterns that have some capacity for memory, or patterns that have capacity for problem solving? Could they be recognizable as kinds of minds?
Okay, I'll leave that section now. I'm going to want to rewind to a bit I did miss earlier. But, yeah, okay, fine, yes, investigate memory. That's okay. I mean, calculators have memory. Again, all you need is a capacitor or something. Anything that can store a charge or store a unit of information. Okay, computation is universal. But once we get out, because memory is not so much a part, it is part of psychology, but they have this word memory, and they have all sorts of different memory. Of course, if you look into psychology, there's like books being written on what memory means there, because it means many different things. But in computer science, it means something else, and it's a fundamental thing. And so, of course, there you can talk about, certainly you can talk about cells having memory. You know, the DNA is literally storing memories of a kind, storing information. So you can call that a memory. But when you use the word cognition and intelligence and stuff, well, then you're really sort of starting to import language from elsewhere. Well, we've talked about this. So let me just go back to a bit I did miss, and this will be the final thing that I'll look at. Okay, so I'm just going to go to a different and final part about how he uses the word know, K-N-O-W.
The video that I was referencing, you will not be surprised to hear, was an older TED Talk and then subsequent interview on stage. And that was sent to me by Adam Goldstein, who's now at Softmax. And that was probably several years ago, I would say at this point, that it was sent to me. Could you perhaps, and I know a lot has happened since, but could you describe some of the experiments that you covered at TED to give people an idea of how this becomes tangible, right? This conversation of bioelectricity becomes tangible.
When we look at biology, we see lots of amazing things. For example, in a salamander, if they lose a limb, they regenerate the limb and they stop when it's complete, right? And in fact, there are many other interesting kinds of things that when anybody looks at it, the first thing they ask is, how does it know to do that? Mm-hmm. And one of the things I discussed in that video was if you scramble the craniofacial organs of a tadpole, they still make a pretty normal frog. They sort themselves out, they move in new paths until they get to a normal frog face, and then they stop. So anybody sees that, and immediately the question is, okay, but how do they know what a proper frog face look like? And if you do know, then how do you know how to get from here to there, right? How do you navigate? So the way we're all taught in biology is that that's a bad question. We are told none of these things know anything. They are mechanical machines that sort of roll forward according to rules of chemistry. And in the end, some cool stuff happens, and we'll call it emergence and things like that. And complexity science will sort of catalog them. But don't worry, none of these things actually know anything.
Again, this is trying to create a spectrum, a smooth continuum for the word know now. And it's just not true that the choices between either these tadpoles or these basic organisms either know in the sense that humans know, or it's just the outworkings of the laws of chemistry. There is another way to go. And the other way to go is that DNA, the genome, contains the knowledge without knowing, without consciously knowing, it contains the knowledge of how to build structures, or to, if you chop off a salamander's tail and then it regrows the tail, how does it know when to stop growing the tail? Well, it doesn't consciously know. It's not thinking, well, now stop growing the tail. Of course not. In the same way that if you cut yourself, it's not like you know when to stop healing yourself. The skin knows. Now, you can talk in this way, but it's not the same way in which a human being knows something. Normally, when we talk about the human being knowing something, we mean that they are, if they explicitly know it, then they understand it and can give an account or an explanation of it. Or if they know how to ride a bike, then they intuitively have an understanding of how to do that thing. But, okay, you can say that these creatures know, but let's notice something here. We can say birds know how to fly. No problem, of course. But pilots know how to fly as well. And aeronautical engineers know how to fly too. But notice that in each case, the how to fly bit and the know are talking about quite different things. No language is perfectly precise. We're always left with ambiguities. How does a bird know how to fly? Well, it knows instinctively. There's something in the genome, in the DNA, which codes for a brain that enables the bird to have memory of some kind, which Michael Levin is very interested in, that instinctively allows it to flap its wings and fly, to become airborne. But it can't give you an account of that. That's quite different. It's quite different to what a pilot can do, who may be able to give you a reasonable explanation of aerodynamics. But the pilot knows how to fly in a different way to what the bird does. The pilot is controlling the aircraft, and both will have explicit explanations and also implicit or inexplicit ones. He can feel the controls of the aircraft. He can feel how the aircraft actually responds. And so he knows how to fly by knowing how the controls work and how the aeroplane feels, and by being able to read the instruments. He has explicit explanations as well. And finally, you get to the aeronautical engineer. How does the aeronautical engineer know how to fly? He knows how things fly in general, quite possibly, and can give you long accounts in terms of the laws of physics and aerodynamics as to how things fly. So now let's reconsider. Birds know how to fly, pilots know how to fly, aeronautical engineers know how to fly. But this word know is doing a lot of work in disguising the crucial differences between those things. Someone like Michael Levin, it appears to me, would want to say, they're all doing the same thing. They all know. There's no bright line we can draw between the bird knowing how to fly and the aeronautical engineer knowing how to fly. But of course there is. If we ask the aeronautical engineer, how is it that a plane flies? He will give a certain account. The pilot will know how to fly by manipulating controls. The bird won't have that capacity, obviously. They all contain knowledge of flight in some way, shape or form, but in very different forms. And if you want to understand the differences, well, then you need to be able to distinguish between them. And just saying it's all in a continuum confuses things. It makes it far more murky. I'll just go on a little bit further with this.
I was trying to describe in that talk is this idea that, well, actually, the idea that chemical processes can in fact know things, it's not magic, it's not Mysterianism. We are chemical processes that know things, and we've had for many decades mature science of including cybernetics and control theory and things like that, a mature science of figuring out how it is that machines of all different kinds can know things and they can have goals and so on.
Yeah, again, we're chemical things that know things and chemical things. So we're just making a grey goo out of everything. Everything, all this stuff just knows stuff. So let's just understand knowing without understanding the distinctions between the knowings. It's like saying a calculator knows how to add up, and we know how to add up. But it's going to be quite different things. What's going on in the circuitry of a calculator and what we're doing in encountering a problem that requires addition are going to be quite different.
So what I tried to show in that talk are some examples by which the living tissues, for example, flatworms that are cut into pieces, and every piece has to figure out how many heads should I have? Where do the heads go? What should the shape of my face be? These kinds of things that, in fact, they do know. And the way they know is because they store memories. And maybe not shockingly, although it's certainly shocking to a lot of folks, the way those memories are stored is in an electrical network that is very similar to the way that we store our goal-directed behavioral repertoires in our brain. And that these things are sort of widely spread. And so regeneration, cancer suppression, and cancer repair and remodeling, birth defects and birth defect repair, all of these things are extensively using electrical pattern memories. And we now have a way to rewrite those pattern memories.
Again, I can accept the similarities. Like we can say, okay, the flatworm knows how to regenerate part of its head, but it's not like the way in which a surgeon knows how to regenerate an arm using microsurgery if someone's lost it. These are different kinds of knowledge. And it's really, we should, try to understand that there are similarities, but differences is the crucial part. And I think that Michael is covering over these differences at times. But again, more power to him. I don't think that anthropomorphizing everything from particles through to cells through to worms, like the worm he said there was thinking to itself, what shape head should I have? Or obviously it's not thinking that. It's not thinking what shape head I should have. It's not thinking at all. Well, he would say it is. But it certainly doesn't have that explicit question in its head. The explicit understanding of what a head is and what shape it should be and all that sort of stuff. And this, we are chemical processes that know things just like other chemical processes that know things. Well, no, not just like. We're very, very special. There is a bright line between us and other creatures that can't explain the world. We can reject magic and the supernatural like Michael is, and I'm with him that far. But to also reject the idea that there's anything particularly special and unique about people is, I think, a confusing move. Yeah, his experiments on worms here, they do remind me a little of those experiments that are done with spider webs. Spiders, are pre-programmed, if you like. They have a memory or whatever. The default memory being for like these beautiful type webs that people know. But then if you put the spider on caffeine, it does a different sort of a web, LSD, a different sort of a web, and so on. So you can perturb the memory in a way. Now, I don't know if it's a permanent effect, possibly not. But yeah, you can do experiments with spiders to change their web. You can do experiments, as Michael does, with worms, change the electricity, and the way in which they heal their own bodies is different. And that's all very interesting work, and more power to the people that do this. But there's something special about people. And I think that although these Sorites problems, so they're called, or the problem of the heap, whether or not a thing is bald, whether or not a thing is intelligent, you can say everything is, but we're still left with the problem. How to cure baldness. Baldness is a real thing, and some people are bald and some people aren't bald. Even if we can't point to a particular place where either side of this many hairs means you're not bald, and this many hairs means you are bald. There's still a problem of baldness, and so too with intelligence, I would say. Even if you can't point to a place or consciousness or whatever it happens to be, that either side of which the thing exists and the thing doesn't exist doesn't mean that there isn't such a line. Or at least a number of points, an interval, where you might say that there's this grey area here. But inside this grey area, we're unsure. But to the right, it's intelligent. And to the left, it's definitely not intelligent. Okay, that'll do for today. It's been a very long one. But until next time, we'll go back to, I think, the fabric of reality. Until then, goodbye.